Now let's set up our year generation. Before we do that, I want to clean some things up here, because obviously my list of triggers and responses is starting to get a little bit long, and I would like to organize this a little bit better. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start grouping things. So I'm going to make a group here. Out of this one, I'm going to call this initialize. So I call this initialize, and let's call this one will be month generation. So let's group this, call this month generation. And I'm going to collapse that for now. Let's take this one and we'll call this month navigation and date selection. So let's take all three of these. Navigation and date selection. Let's collapse that. I'm going to take my initialize, I'm going to move it up into this one up here, so it's part of initialize. And this one, it doesn't really sit in any one of these, but let's just make our own group for it, and we'll just call this messages in. If we want to add more messages, we can put them under here. Now our component is a little bit better organized. So now when we add in the interaction to turn this into something that we can generate, we can keep it nice and contained. So we don't just end up with a long list of all sorts of things that make it difficult to figure out what's going on. Okay, the way this is going to work is I'm going to use a repeating loop in order to generate my years from my beginning year to my end year. So that's the first thing I'm going to want to set here. I'm going to create a variable, and we're going to call this min_year, and this will be a number. I'm going to default it to 1900, and I'm going to make it overridable, so that way I can change it on a per copy basis. And let's duplicate this, and I'm going to make this one max year. And I'm going to default this to 2100. And like I did before, I'm going to drag these so that way they're up here, so that way they are part of my configuration variables as opposed to my working variables. And at scene start, I want to kick off a loop that's going to start from my min year, continually add one line of text until I get to my last year. Let's add a trigger here. If you've seen my TV masterclass, you'll know how I'm going to make a loop. I'm going to do it in the same way that I showed you there, where I'm going to have a receive trigger that repeatedly sends a message to itself until it's reached the end of whatever it needs to work through. So let's make a receive. From current component, remember I want this private inside my component, so receive from current component. And the message will be generate year list. And let's copy this from self. There we go. This is going to loop through my years one at a time. And each time it's going to check, am I on the last year? If not, I'm going to add 1 year to my list, and then I'm going to move on to the next year. And that's going to repeat until it reaches that last condition of, am I on the last year in the list? If so, add that to the list and then stop looping. I need a way to count. So I'm going to make a variable. I'm going to call this year counter. And this is going to start at 0. In my initialize, I'm going to kick off this loop. So I'm going to say send to current component, and I'm going to send that message, generate year list. And I'm going to send a value together, and I'm going to send the value 0. So we're going to send generate year list. And then this receive, I'm going to assign that to a variable. So I'm going to assign that to year counter. This is going to make sense in a minute. You're saying that, okay, well, this was 0, and that's what year counter currently equals. So why am I reassigning it back to year counter? This is going to make sense in a moment. I need 2 conditions. Am I on my last year? If not, add a line of text and then loop, move on to the next year. If I am on the last year, add a line of text, and then that's it. You're done. So let's do this. I'm going to make a condition, and this is going to be a calculation. So I'm going to use a formula. If min year plus year counter. If it's less than max year, then I'm going to go through my looping part of this whole interaction. All right, and then I want to add a line of text. Now, I could update this text object directly, but I'm going to wait until I'm done with my loop before I update this text. So instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to keep a variable. So let's make one, and I'm going to call this year list. This will be text, and it's important that this is text and not a number. I do not want this to be a number. I want this to be text, and that will allow me to continue to append text onto it. So then I'm going to use assign to year list, and year list is going to start by being empty. But what I want to do is each time I iterate through here, I want to take whatever the value of year list is, and I want to add on the current year to that list. So I'm going to start with year list, so whatever it currently happened to be, plus, and then I want to do a bit of math in here first before I update this text variable. So in order for me to treat this part as math and the rest of this as joining text, I'm going to put it inside brackets here. And I'm going to say min year plus year counter. That will force this to be done as math first. ProtoPie is pretty smart and knows that, okay, well, min year is a number. Year counter is a number. When I add these together, I want to do math. I don't want to join text. However, year list is text. And whenever you have a plus after text, ProtoPie will be like, oh, okay, well, you want to add on whatever comes after as text. So if I were to do it like this, then it would take whatever year list is, then it would put the value of min year, which is 1900, and then it would put the value of year counter. So you would end up with this weird string of numbers, and that's not what we want. So by putting this in brackets first, ProtoPie will look at this first and be like, okay, that's number plus number. This is math. Then I have this. I've got text plus this is now joining text. So I'm going to take year list, and I'm going to add the sum of whatever I'm adding here. And then lastly, I want to add a line break. I want this to move on to the next line. And there's a special character we can use for that. So I'm going to say plus, and then inside quotes, I'm going to use the backslash. This is the one above the enter key, and then the letter N. This has a very special meaning. Notice how it gets colored a little bit different here. This is a very special meaning. This means new line character. So essentially what this is doing is this is making a multi-line text variable. And every time I add a year to the list, it's now going to move on to the next line where it will be ready to receive the next year. So I'm going to say that. And I'm going to say append current year to year list. Okay. And then I want to loop. So I'm going to send to the current component. And I'm going to send that message, generate year list. And I want to send the value together. And here is where I am going to increase my year counter by 1. So I'm going to take the current value of year counter, and I'm going to say plus 1. Say OK to that. And then let's copy this. All right. Now I need my exit condition. This is when I am on the last year. So I'm going to duplicate this condition. And this is going to say if min year plus year counter equals max year. I'm on the last year. And the first thing I want to do is I do not want to loop anymore. This is going to be the last time I work with this. So I'm going to remove this. And I am going to append this, but I'm not going to append a new line. I don't want a new line at the end of this. I want it to end here. So I'm going to change this. I'm going to change this to remove that new line character. And then lastly, all I've been doing is update a variable. I now want to take that variable and I want to change the value of this text box, so this year list, with the value of that variable. So I'm going to say text, year list, formula, and it's going to be my year list variable. All right, let's see this in action. Then I'll go back and I'll step through this so we can see exactly what's going on. Let's preview this. And there we go, we saw it. Now it took a moment, I'm going to talk about that in a minute, but we do have 1900. And if I scroll down, it should go all the way to 2100. And we've got this extra line. We're going to deal with that in a second too. But we do have years all the way from 1900 all the way to 2100. And because this is a paging container, it will stop on any one particular year. Okay, so a couple of quirks we need to deal with. Number one, we've got this extra line character. I'm going to deal with that in a second. Number two, we've got a problem where when we generate the year, it takes a moment. So here, let's do this again. And you're going to see it takes about a second or two to do that. This is something we're just going to have to live with. The way that this looping mechanism works, because I'm using send and receive creatively to make a loop, send and receive was never designed to be a looping mechanism. So while if this were done with code, this could be done in a blink of an eye, because it's doing this send and receive, there is some kind of render step in between the send and the receive. Now, this is not, you don't think of it as a single frame, because you'll notice it does this in a little bit more than a second, which would make this, 2,000 frames per second almost, because I've got 2,000 entries in here. And I can tell you for a fact, my GPU is not that fast. But ProtoPie is waiting for something in between each send and receive, which is slowing this down. So it does make it a little bit inefficient. However, it's the only way we have to do a loop, so we are just going to have to live with that. This will be hidden anyway, and as long as you don't try to bring up the quick selection within that first second or so, you're not going to notice. The second problem we have, I scroll all the way to the bottom of the list, and I have this blank space in here. And I spent a lot of time trying to figure out why this is, because there's nothing in our loop here that should be doing that. We are only adding a new line character when we're not on the last year. So when we're not on the last line. This one right here, I've removed that new line character, meaning that it shouldn't be adding another line. And I can tell you it's not adding another line because if I add an outline to this, so let's take year list and let's add a border to it. And if I preview this, you're going to see that, let's scroll all the way to the bottom. Here we go. See, that line ends at the end of there. So there's not an extra line of text that's in here. I've been able to chalk this up as just a weird quirk of me using this year list. This is an auto height text layer. And then updating it dynamically through here. Somehow ProtoPie is interpreting this to be one line taller than it actually is. And in order to work around this, I actually have to not use this auto height. So instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to set this to a fixed height. And then when I do that, I'm going to calculate the exact height that I need. And this is going to be easy because it's just a multiple of 48. And it's going to be my max year minus my minimum year times 48. Right? Plus 1, and I'll explain the plus 1 in a moment. I can pre-calculate exactly the height that I'm going to need. So let's make a scale response on the year list text box, which is great, year list. And I'm going to scale the height, and this is going to be a calculation. So I'm going to take max year minus min year times 48. And I want to make sure that I do this math first, which is why I've got it inside brackets. So I want to make sure that it does the subtraction first and then times 48. Now I mentioned that this needs to be plus 1. And if we think about this logically, this is going to make sense. So let's say I make my minimum year 1900 and my maximum year 1901. That's 2 years I want to display, 1900 and 1901. If I did max year minus min year, so 1901 minus 1900, that's going to give me 1. 1 times 48. So that's going to give me enough room for 1 line of text. But what I actually want is 2. So this is always going to be plus 1. If these were the same year, if max year and min year were both 1900, 1900 minus 1900 is 0, that would make it a height of 0 times 48. But by doing plus 1, then that's 1 times 48, and that would give me a height of 1. And that's the 1 year that I want. Okay, let's say okay to that. And I don't want this scale to be animated, so I'm going to set this to 0. And we'll call this scale year list. Now this is going to scale to the exact height that I need. So let's preview this. And in a moment there, we'll see that updated. And if I scroll this all the way to the bottom, there we go. Now that's working. Again, I haven't been able to figure out if there is another way around this so we can use the auto height. So we got to do this a long way and calculate it ourselves. But it is giving us the exact scrolling that we need. Okay, great. Let's turn that border off. We no longer need that. All right, we've used a loop to generate our list. This one, we didn't need to use a loop for because we know our months. It's always going to be January to December. This one, we've done this in a loop, and we've been able to generate beginning to end. Now, I could have done this side in a loop as well. And let's say I wanted to make this configurable so I could choose to say, oh, I always want to format it with the full name of the month, or maybe I want to use the 3-digit one. Well, I could make creative use of the format date function and then iterate through the numbers 1 to 12 and then format that month as necessary based on the formatting one. And I can make a loop out of this in the same way that I'm making out of this. Now, the last thing I want to do with these lists is I want them to be by default on the month and year that's currently being rendered. So we have the month and year variables, and by default we are assigning to the current year and month. I would want to see this by default on February 2024. So let's do that. Let's do that within here, and we'll also do that under this last condition here. We are going to scroll those two lists to where they need to be. And again, I just need to calculate a multiple of 48. My lists are paging containers of a paging distance of 48, so it's always a multiple of 48. The month is going to be easy. So if I'm month 1, then I'm going to do 1 times 48, although 1 times 48 is going to actually put me on February. So again, I'm off by 1, so I have to do month minus 1 times 48. Let's use a scroll response on the month scroller. That's this one. Scroll to formula, month minus 1 times 48. It's okay to that. I'm going to set this to 0. I should see this on February when this is done. Yep, there we go, February. And I'm going to do the same thing with the year list. So this is scroll month. And I'm going to do the same thing with the year list. So let's add another scroll response. Scroll. This time it's going to be the year scroller. And I'm going to scroll to, and again, this is a calculation. I want a multiple of 48, but what multiple of 48? Again, let's think about this logically. If the year, it was currently 1900, and my minimum year is 1900, well, I want to subtract the current year minus the minimum year and multiply that by 48. So if my year were 1900, I take 1900, subtract the minimum year, which is 1900, gives me 0. 0 times 48 is 0, and that's going to give me my scroll position of 0. So this is an even simpler calculation. I'm going to say my year variable minus min year times 48. Let's say okay to that. I don't want this animated. Let's preview this. And there we go. I have February 2024 in this list already. Now, I don't like that I can see construction first of all. So if I change this, you're going to see that I can see the years that I had in here by default. I don't like that I can see them. So instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this year list, and for the moment, I need to drag it outside, and I'm just going to delete them all, and I'm going to change the height of this one to be 48. So that way it's just sitting in the center like this. And let's put our year list back inside here. And now when I preview this, There we go. Now I don't see the construction, and this now updates to the current year as I need it to be. I could do something similar with the months where I could hide them until I'm ready to show it, but I'll be honest, when we have this in place, it's going to be hidden by default anyway, so I don't really have to overthink this too much. Now let's set this up so that way when I click the cancel or the done buttons, cancel is the easy one. If I cancel, then whatever changes I've made here, I'm just going to discard and then just return to my month display as I had it before. If I click on done, then I want to commit the changes that I've made here and then update my month list for now the new month and date as selected in the list. So let's do the easy one first. If I click on the cancel button, cancel is easy. Add trigger. Tap on the cancel button. Then all I'm going to do is set the opacity of the quick select container to 0. And I'm going to leave this animated because I do want to see this animated as it shows and hides. Okay, that's the easy one. The done button is going to be a little bit trickier because I now have to figure out what's been selected based on the scroll position. Now this is just going to be a reverse of the calculations that we did here. Let's change this to year. It's going to be reverse of these calculations. While this was a multiple of 48, we're going to divide by 48 and figure out from there what year or month has been selected. So let's add a tap to the done button. Tap. Done button. And now I am going to update my month and year variables. So the month and year variables, I'm going to update them with calculations. Here, let's hide all that again. I'm going to update my month and year variables with calculations based on the scroll position of these two. So let's do this. I'm going to assign month. And what I can do is I can divide the scroll position by 48 and then add 1. It's essentially a reverse of this, where I subtracted 1 from the month and then multiplied by 48. Well, I want to do the reverse. It's going to be the scroll position divided by 48 plus 1. So if I'm on January, the scroll position is 0. 0 divided by 48 is 0. And then plus 1 will give me January. So assign month is... that'll be the month scroller. That's this one right here. Divided by 48 plus 1. Oh, sorry, month scroller. I want the scroll position. The scroll offset. There we go. That's better. Okay, now you might be asking, well, why didn't I put this in brackets? Why didn't I do it like this? Because I want this to be first. Well, you can, and there's nothing wrong with this. This won't break anything. However, if we think back to when we learned order of operations in school, we'll know that multiplication and division happens first, followed by arithmetic. So this is just going to operate in the correct order anyway. So I'll say OK to that. Assign month. And I'm going to do the same thing for year. So assign to my year variable. And this is going to be, again, a reverse of this calculation. So I'm going to take the scroll position, divide it by 48, and add min year. So if I've picked 1901, for example, then taking my scroll position divided by 48 is going to give me 1. Min year plus 1 is 1901. Assign. And my formula is going to be the scroll position. So that's the year scroller dot scroll offset divided by 48 and then plus min year. And then lastly, I'm going to generate my month. So let's grab this, generate month, and we'll put you here. Now, obviously, I don't want my quick select to be visible by default, so let's hide it. Let's set its opacity to 0. And I'm going to add a tap trigger to this entire month display here. So this selected month container, I'm going to add a tap trigger to that. So add trigger, tap, selected month container. And I'm going to set the opacity on this. So opacity of the quick select up to 100. Okay, so let's see that in action. Now I should be able to click on here, and there we go. It is now on February 2024, and if I hit cancel, okay, great. Let's do that again, and let's change our selection to be some other year. I'm going to hit cancel again, and then we're on February 2024. Okay, great. Let's click this again, and now let's select something. So let's do November 2044. November 2024, 2044. Hit done. And that's not working. Why not? So let's take a look at our done button here. All right, we're not hiding it, so we still need to hide it. Okay. Let's do this again. So let's now pick our, let's say April 2034, and I click done, and I'm on April 2034. Perfect. And then when I click this again, so let's say I go to October, and then I go to, I don't know, October 1934. When I cancel this, it discards the change. But when I click on this again, I don't want this to be in October 1934. I want it to reflect whatever has been selected here. And if I go forward in time using the arrows, and then I select this again, I want this to be on whatever month and year. October 2034, I want it to be October 2034. Well, we already know how to scroll these items into the position that we want. We did that. We did that right here, right? I don't need to do it here. I only need to do it when I show it. So that's this tap right here. When I tap this selected month container, I can just move these down here. All right, and let's copy this and paste it here. And instead of 0, this is going to say 100. Let's preview this. And now, if I go forward in time, I click on this, it's now on August 2024. And if I go to some other month and year that I don't want and I hit cancel, and I click on this again, there we go, August 2024. And if I change this to, say, June, I don't know, let's say June 2088, and I say done, it's now taking me to June 2088. And if I go, let's say to November 2087, and I click on this, I'm on November 2087. There we go. That's my quick selection working perfectly. Okay, let's do a little bit of cleanup here. Let's put all of this into a group, and we'll call this quick selection.